The gaslight hisses, casting a warm but fragile glow over the polished furniture of a respectable London drawing room. Outside, the city's perpetual damp presses against the window panes, held back by thick velvet curtains. The air inside smells of beeswax and faint, dried lavender. On a small table next to a chaise lounge, a book lies open but untouched. Beside it sits a cold teacup and a small dark blue glass bottle. It's this unassuming little bottle, more than the fireplace or the family portraits, that's really in charge of the mood in this room. It's the silent keeper of the home's peace. From the outside, this is the picture of Victorian domestic bliss, a world of order, propriety, and feminine grace. But inside these quiet, respectable homes, a silent and sneaky epidemic was taking hold. It wasn't a plague you could catch from the foggy air, or a fever with obvious symptoms. It was a crisis that came in a bottle, prescribed by a trusted doctor, bought discreetly from the corner chemist, and taken in the privacy of a lady's bedroom. This is the story of how opium, praised as a miracle cure, became a source of secret suffering for countless women in Victorian London, turning a medical remedy into a mother's ruin and trapping a generation in the quiet, desperate grip of addiction. Let's imagine a woman, we'll call her Eleanor, living in the 1870s. She's the wife of a successful merchant, a mother of 3, and runs a well-kept home in a nice borough like Islington. Her life is a carefully managed performance of what a Victorian woman should be. Her days are a string of duties, planning meals with the cook, overseeing the kids' lessons, making social calls, and making sure her home is a perfect sanctuary for her husband. But underneath it all, Eleanor is in constant, quiet pain. Years of difficult childbirths have left her with chronic discomfort. The rigid corset she wears every day makes it hard to breathe. And the sheer, grinding monotony of her life, a world of tiny duties and suppressed dreams, has created a constant anxiety her doctor calls hysteria. To get why so many women like Eleanor fell for opium, you have to understand the world they lived in. For them, it was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place filled with physical pain and psychological straitjackets. The ideal Victorian woman was the angel in the house, a term made famous by a poem of the era. She was expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Her whole life was defined by her family. Her place was the home, a haven she had to maintain while her husband dealt with the dirty world of business. But this ideal came at a huge cost. Women's lives were physically demanding in ways we can barely imagine. Housework, even with a servant or two, was brutal. Before modern appliances, cleaning, laundry, and cooking were back-breaking chores. On top of that, just being a woman in the 19th century was painful and dangerous. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were medical minefields, and doctors didn't have much to offer for safe or effective relief. The medical profession, which was run entirely by men, tended to see women's bodies as naturally flawed. The going belief was that women were the weaker sex, ruled by their delicate and mysterious reproductive organs. The word hysteria actually comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, because it was once believed that a wandering womb caused all sorts of female problems. While that theory was mostly gone by the 19th century, the core idea stuck. Women's emotions and health were unstable because of their biology. As a result, a ton of different symptoms got lumped under vague diagnoses like female troubles, nervous exhaustion, or the classic hysteria. This could mean anything from menstrual cramps and postpartum depression to anxiety, insomnia, or just feeling down. Basically, any woman who wasn't perfectly placid and submissive could be labeled as sick. A woman who was ambitious, creative, or just plain unhappy with her limited life wasn't seen as a person with real problems, but as a patient with a nervous disorder. The treatments could be bizarre and sometimes horrible. They range from forced bed rest, the infamous rest cure, to invasive procedures like hysterectomies. Given these awful options, it's no wonder that both doctors and patients wanted a simpler, faster solution. A Victorian woman's life was also incredibly restrictive. While her brother went to school to prepare for a career, her education was designed to make her a good wife. She learned to play the piano or sketch, but these were just decorative skills to make her a better companion for her husband. Her world was small and private, an endless cycle of managing the house, the kids, and social visits. For many, this led to chronic boredom and loneliness, a feeling that neurologists at the time were starting to call neurasthenia. It was into this world of physical pain, medical ignorance, and psychological confinement that opium arrived, not as a scary drug, but as a welcome, almost magical, solution. It promised what nothing else could: quick, effective, and cheap relief from all the things that made life miserable for Victorian women. It was the perfect medicine for a gilded cage. The year 536 does not move like other years. Time itself feels caught in a haze, heavy as the smoke that drifts endlessly across the northern sky. Each morning begins with the same dim gray light, so faint that it cannot be trusted. A farmer wakes and stares at the horizon, unsure if dawn has truly come or if it is only a trick of the clouded heavens. Roosters crow at uncertain hours, confused by the weak sun that struggles to pierce the gloom. The rhythm of life, once guided by a steady arc of brightness, falters under this shadow that never lifts. Villages stir in uneasy silence. Houses built of timber and thatch hold little warmth. Even in what should be the season of growth, breath rises in the chill air as if winter has refused to release its grip. Women step outside with baskets, hoping to gather herbs or wild greens, only to find the ground stiff with frost where none should be. Men walk to fields with their wooden plows, but the soil resists, hard and reluctant, clinging to the cold that has sunk deep into its bones. A year that should have promised life instead carries the taste of famine. In such villages, survival becomes a quiet art. Families measure their food with anxious care. A handful of barley is stretched into porridge so thin it hardly clings to the spoon. Old stores of grain, once kept for lean winters, are brought out long before their time. Mothers teach children to chew slowly, to let hunger sit quietly without complaint. The hollow sound of empty stomachs echoes louder than any festival song. Nights are long, restless, and heavy with the weight of unanswered prayers. Travelers moving along broken roads bring stories that deepen the despair. A merchant, wrapped in woolen cloth, speaks of cities where bread costs a fortune, where a single loaf is guarded as if it were treasure. A wandering monk shares word of monasteries offering alms, though their stores too are thinning with each passing month. Others tell of seas turned gray beneath the same lifeless sky, of harbors where fishermen mend nets they cannot use, for the fish no longer gather as before. Each tale adds to the sense that the whole world has been wrapped in one dark cloak, a punishment or a trial none can escape. Animals suffer alongside humankind. Cows grow thin, their ribs showing beneath dull hides. Sheep wander meadows where grass refuses to rise, bleeding with hunger that no shepherd can answer. Chickens lay fewer eggs, if any at all, their nests sitting empty while children wait in vain. Dogs scavenge at the edges of villages, once loyal guardians now desperate for scraps. Even wild creatures move differently. Deer step cautiously from forests, drawn to fields where nothing grows, and wolves grow bold as they search near huts for the scent of food. The balance between man and beast shifts in uneasy ways. Yet in the midst of hardship, people continue. They gather in the cool glow of firelight, telling stories older than memory. Around hearths, grandparents recall years of plenty, of golden harvests and bright festivals, as if repeating them might call those days back again. Children listen wide-eyed, trying to imagine a sky that once blazed with blue, a sun that warmed the earth without struggle. Some are too young to remember such a thing. For them, the world has always been this dim, this uncertain. Their childhood is shaped not by playing green fields, but by waiting, by silence, by the constant reminder of hunger. Faith grows both stronger and more fragile in such times. In small chapels of stone, voices rise in hymns, though many sing through trembling lips. Priests speak of trials meant to test devotion, of suffering that will pass when the heavens decide. Offerings are laid upon altars, sometimes the very last coins or scraps of food a family can spare. Pilgrims walk barefoot across frozen ground, believing that each painful step might ease the judgment of the sky. Others question quietly, whispering doubts that cannot be spoken aloud. How could light itself abandon the earth, if not for some terrible sin? Is the world nearing its end? Not all answers are sought in prayer. Some turn to old remedies, to whispers carried down from ancestors. Herbs are burned in hopes of driving away the heavy air. Charcoal is hung in doorways to catch the sickness that seems to follow the gloom. In hidden corners, wise women brew potions of bitter taste, claiming they bring strength to endure what cannot be changed. Whether through faith, through custom, or through desperate invention, each family clings to something, however fragile, to make sense of the days that drift by in endless gray. Travel between villages grows more dangerous with each passing month. Roads once marked by familiar milestones now feel endless, for the sky gives no clear sign of time. Caravans move slowly, guarded against both thieves and hunger. Bands of desperate men roam the edges of forests, taking what they can from travelers who carry food. Even so, some still risk the journey, driven by hope of finding places where harvests might yet survive. Few succeed. Many return empty-handed, shoulders bent with exhaustion, faces hollow with despair. Still, life finds ways to continue. Children play with carved wooden toys, their laughter faint but present even against the chill. Lovers meet by rivers, exchanging small gifts, a woven cord, a polished stone, as if such tokens might hold the promise of brighter days. Farmers plant seeds though they doubt the earth will answer, for to do nothing feels worse. Women stitch clothes from old fabric, turning worn cloth into garments that hold together a little longer. In small, stubborn acts, humanity refuses to yield completely. The seasons themselves feel uncertain. Spring does not bloom. Summer carries a cold breath, its warmth hidden behind the veil of ash and cloud. Autumn offers no abundance, only fields that echo with silence. Winter, when it comes, is harsher than memory can hold. Snow falls heavier, lingering longer upon the roofs of homes already burdened by hunger. Fires burn low, for wood too becomes scarce, as forests are cut back to feed the endless need for warmth. The world seems locked in a cycle of struggle, one that mocks the old rhythms of time. Beyond villages, in the halls of kings and emperors, decisions are made that ripple outward. Armies march with less certainty, for soldiers cannot live on promises alone. Grain meant to feed cities is seized by rulers, leaving common folk to starve. Taxes are demanded even when fields lie barren. Letters carried across kingdoms speak of failing trade, of markets where spices, silks, and metals matter less than a single sack of wheat. Power itself trembles when the earth refuses to provide. No throne feels secure when the sky above withholds its light. And yet, stories persist. Around fires, elders speak of other dark years long ago, years when skies dimmed and harvests failed, yet life endured. They tell of ancestors who outlasted storms, plagues, and invasions, who found a way to rebuild when all seemed lost. These tales do not erase hunger, but they kindle a quiet strength. If others survived before, perhaps these people too will see the return of warmth. Perhaps the gray sky will one day clear, and children will wake to a dawn that truly glows again. In the stillness of such hope, humanity drifts onward. Each day is endured rather than lived, each night survived rather than welcomed. Yet within that endurance lies a strange kind of resilience, a soft flame that refuses to die. Though the world seems to falter, people walk on, carrying with them the memory of light, the longing for warmth, and the stubborn belief that no darkness lasts forever. The third morning in that distant Victorian town begins with the same gray light that seems to cling gently to every brick and beam. The mist of London is never far away, even here in this quiet quarter, and it makes the rooftops look softened and dreamlike. The cobbles are still damp from the drizzle of the night, and the sound of early wheels and hooves on the stone streets carries up through the half-open shutters of narrow houses. Inside one of those houses, life begins in much the same way it did the day before. A kettle is set upon the stove, and the sharp tang of coal smoke rises as kindling catches flame. A child yawns in a small cot, rubbing eyes that still want sleep. A woman moves slowly about the kitchen, apron already dusted with flour, and a man folds his collar carefully before setting out his boots for work. It is a rhythm, a repeated scene, but in repetition there is safety. And in this age, safety is a precious thing. The father of this household, like many, works in a shop that sells remedies. These shops are everywhere, perched on corners and tucked into alleys, their windows painted with swirling letters promising cures for coughs, nerves, digestion, and every manner of complaint. Inside them, bottles of every size and color line the walls, each containing powders, liquids, or dried herbs. Some of these bottles hold real medicine, carefully measured. Others, however, contain substances that today would seem surprising, even alarming. There are jars of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, considered a household necessity in the 19th century. It is given for sleeplessness, for headaches, for the cries of infants, and for grief itself. There are small green tins of cocaine lozenges, sold for sore throats and toothache. There are powders of morphine, syrups of chloroform, and even tonics laced with strychnine in minuscule amounts, thought to strengthen the body when carefully dosed. To step into such a shop is to walk into a place where every shelf seems to promise relief, and yet behind that promise lurks a quiet danger. As the man straightens his coat and prepares to leave, his wife hands him a parcel. Inside is a loaf of bread, still warm, and wrapped beside it a small vial of bitters steeped in alcohol, something he sells but also sometimes takes himself to ward off fatigue. He nods, kisses the top of the child's head, and steps into the fog that blurs the street into shades of gray. By mid-morning, the shop is busy. The bell over the door rings again and again as people come with coins clenched tightly in hand. A dock worker buys a bottle of laudanum, not for pain but for sleep. His work is long, and the ache in his shoulders will not ease without it. A mother buys Godfrey's cordial, a syrup sweet with opium, to quiet the cries of her infant while she takes in sewing. An older man purchases coca wine, which he insists helps his digestion and spirits. Each transaction is quick, and each is accepted without question. To the people of this time, these things are ordinary. The bottles are not hidden away, and the substances within them are not spoken of in hushed tones. They are advertised in newspapers with bold claims. They are recommended by doctors and neighbors alike, and so the little shop is not a shadowy place of secrets, but a trusted part of the community, as ordinary as a bakery or a butcher's stall. Yet if one lingers here long enough, one begins to see a quieter story. There is the woman who returns again and again, each week paler than the last, her hands trembling as she counts her coins. There is the young apprentice who sneaks a sip of cocoa wine behind the counter, his laughter a little too quick, his steps a little too unsteady. There is the child whose mother doses him with cordial until his eyes close, not knowing that in sleep his small body must work hard against the heavy weight of the drug. The shopkeeper, though he knows, does not say much. To him, this is simply the world as it is. He was taught by his own father to measure carefully, to wrap bottles neatly, and to let the customer believe what they must. There is no sense of wrongdoing here, only habit, trade, and the turning of days. Meanwhile, outside in the street, another figure hurries along. A medical student, books clutched beneath his arm, glances quickly into the shop window as he passes. He is learning a new kind of knowledge, one that questions these very cures. He has heard lectures about the dangerous grip of opium, about the risks of cocaine, about the shadows cast by substances once thought harmless. He feels torn, walking between two worlds, the old one of freely sold tonics and the new one of laboratory science and clinical trials. The future is coming, but slowly, and for now the bottles remain on their shelves. As evening draws in, the lamps are lit and the fog grows thicker. The man closes the shop shutters and counts the coins from the day's trade. His hands are tired, his back stiff, but there is a small measure of pride in knowing he has provided what his neighbors wanted. He pockets the coins and turns the key in the lock, then begins the walk home through the quiet, mist-dampened streets. Back at the house, supper is laid out, bread, broth, and a bit of cheese. The child leans sleepily against the mother's arm, and she hums a soft tune. The man sips a little of the bitters he carried home. The fire crackles faintly, and for a time the outside world disappears. What lingers, however, is the truth that so many lives are intertwined with the substances resting on those shop shelves, remedies that soothe but also bind, medicines that comfort but also claim. For now, no one questions too deeply. For now, the fog covers everything with its soft veil, and the night carries the sound of hooves and wheels fading into distance. And so another day in this Victorian town passes into memory. The rhythm continues, the bottles remain, the quiet dependence deepens, unnoticed, as the city drifts once more into sleep. The morning stretched on with the kind of quiet rhythm that belonged only to days when work and survival filled every breath. In the small settlement, there was never a time when the body could rest without cost, and so the hours of light were always given over to duty. Men, women, and even children carried the burden of their labor, each knowing that one person's effort supported the survival of another. At the edge of the village, near the weaving sheds, voices mingled with the sound of looms creaking. The long beams groaned in a steady cadence, up and down, back and forth, a rhythm so constant that it almost became a kind of heartbeat for the workers. Woven cloth was one of the lifelines of the settlement, as necessary for warmth as it was for trade. Bolts of wool or linen could be exchanged with travelers, and the colors and textures spoke of hours upon hours of care. The women sat upright on narrow benches, their hands moving with deliberate precision. One would thread, another would beat the shuttle across, while another tightened and smoothed the lines. Wool had been washed, carded, and spun beforehand, each thread wound into skeins that looked like twisted rope. Linen had been softened and drawn into strands finer and more fragile than wool. The work of weaving was not quick. It required patience, attention, and above all, endurance. The smell of fibers and the faint tang of dye clung to the air. Dyed cloth, though more valuable, demanded much preparation. Some of the older women had learned to use roots and berries to stain the wool, while others experimented with imported powders or traded colors. A faded blue could come from certain plants, while dark browns and reds came from bark or earth mixed with iron. Children often helped by pounding the berries or boiling water in small clay pots. Their laughter, when it bubbled up, softened the monotony of the task. Across the settlement, near the open fields, men and older boys bent their backs to the soil. The plow, drawn by oxen, cut heavy lines through the damp ground. Where the soil was loose, men worked with spades and hoes, breaking clumps, spreading seeds by hand. They planted barley and wheat, crops that would sustain them through the harsher months. It was never guaranteed that the yield would be strong. A late frost or a heavy rain could undo weeks of effort, and so every handful of grain sown was an act of both hope and gamble. Sweat darkened the tunics of the men, the fabric clinging to their shoulders as they leaned into their tools. The smell of earth rose with every turn of the soil, rich and loamy. Birds swooped down to pick at exposed insects, darting away whenever a spade struck near. The work went on without pause, for daylight was precious, and the season waited for no one. Near the granary, women oversaw the stored supplies. The building was modest, but its importance could not be overstated. Inside, sacks of grain were stacked carefully on raised platforms, away from damp and pests. Rats and mice were always a threat, so traps and cats were kept nearby. Children often had the job of watching for intruders, their eyes sharp for any flicker of movement. The sound of grain shifting inside its sacks had its own music, like dry whispers of a secret. Closer to the river, others busied themselves with washing and tanning hides. The smell there was sharp and often unpleasant, yet it was necessary. Animal skins were stretched, scraped, and treated with mixtures that would preserve them. Leather was essential for shoes, belts, and harnesses. Without it, the villagers would walk barefoot, and the animals could not be worked properly. Men used knives to scrape away the flesh, while women rubbed fat and mixtures into the stretched hides, softening them by hand. Their palms grew rough, the skin cracking from long hours of contact with chemicals and water. By midday, the settlement was alive with sound. The clang of blacksmith hammers carried from the forge, the scrape of knives from the tannery, the creak of looms from the weaving sheds, and the murmur of voices everywhere. Each sound was distinct, but together they created the chorus of survival. There was no quiet in such a place, only the overlapping songs of labor. Children, too, had their share of tasks. Some fetched water from the river, balancing wooden buckets on their shoulders. Others gathered sticks and branches for the fire pits. A few were sent to herd the goats or chickens, making sure none wandered into danger. Though their legs were small and their hands untrained, their work mattered. Even the youngest understood that the settlement depended on many hands, not just the strongest. As the sun climbed, shadows shortened and the heat grew heavier. The air shimmered above the fields and sweat stung the eyes of the workers, yet they did not stop. They paused only long enough to sip water or wipe their foreheads with the backs of their hands. Food could wait until the evening. Work could not. The elder of the settlement, a man whose hair had gone silver with age, moved from one group to another. He offered little in the way of words, but his presence carried weight. His eyes lingered on the crops, the tools, the piles of wood stacked for the coming months. He carried in his memory the years when storms ruined the fields or when sickness spread too quickly. His careful gaze reminded the others that each task today was a shield against hardship tomorrow. In the small square near the center of the settlement, some women gathered with baskets of herbs. They laid the plants out in the sun to dry, spreading them on woven mats. Bundles of thyme, sage, and wild garlic gave off their scent, sharp and earthy. These herbs would season meals and, more importantly, serve as medicine when fever struck. A healer bent over them, her fingers nimble as she tied small bundles together. She murmured as she worked, half to herself, half to the plants. Her skill was trusted, though her remedies were not always certain. Still, in a place where doctors were unknown, her knowledge meant survival. By late afternoon, fatigue pressed heavily on the villagers. Muscles ached and hands were raw, yet the work continued. Wood was split and stacked, stones were cleared from the edges of the fields, and tools were sharpened for the next day. The cycle never ended. It was not a matter of choice but necessity. As the sun began to lower, its light turned golden across the settlement. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of smoke from cooking fires being prepared. The villagers slowly began to gather what they had completed for the day. Skeins of wool were tied off, tools were put away, and baskets of herbs were lifted indoors. Children herded the last of the animals into their pens, their bare feet dusty from the fields. The elder's voice rose above the din, not with command, but with simple calm. It was enough to mark the close of labor. Soon, food would be shared, and the people would sit together in the common spaces. For now, they could breathe a little easier, knowing the day's work was done. The quiet after work was its own reward. The fields lay marked with lines of effort, the loom stood still, and the smoke from the forge softened into the dusk. It was a peace that came not from leisure but from completion. The people of the settlement, weary though they were, had once again met the demands of survival. And tomorrow they would rise again to do the same. The morning mist lay low across the wide fields. From a distance, they looked like blankets of pale smoke, soft and drifting, but closer, one could see the heavy dew bending the grass into dark arches. Every step pressed the wet earth into silence, each footprint a quiet record of the passing hour. The land was not loud, it did not demand, it did not call out in haste. It merely waited, still and patient, for the hands that would touch it again. Villages in that time did not know machinery that roared. They knew no thunder of iron wheels nor sharp edges of modern blades. They had instead the rhythm of arms and shoulders, the push of a plow behind an ox, the bend of the back in steady repetition. The land gave what it could, not all at once, not in excess, but in measured portions, like a patient elder telling stories slowly so each word might rest in memory. When the men and women stepped into the fields, they carried tools shaped by the needs of many generations. A wooden rake, its handle worn smooth by decades of fingers. A spade, blackened at the tip from countless hours cutting into earth. A sickle curved like a crescent moon, gleaming in the morning light. These tools were not just objects. They were continuations of older lives, of ancestors who had once used the very same patterns of wood and iron. One could almost imagine the past still clinging to them, whispering through each scrape against the soil. The sowing season was one of patience. Each seed was a tiny risk, hidden in the soil where no eyes could see its progress. Villagers would press them down carefully, never rushing, knowing that haste would not change the pace of nature. A child might scatter too many in one place, their little hand unsure of measure, and an elder would step beside them, gently guiding with a steady palm. Too many seeds together, they would explain softly, and none will grow strong. Give them space, give them room, give them time. The quiet spread across the fields during this work. Conversation, when it came, was soft and simple. A note about the sky, a murmur about last season, a word of thanks when someone offered water from a clay jug. Voices carried easily in the open air, but there was no shouting. The rhythm of labor did not invite loudness. It invited stillness, breath moving in time with motion, each gesture blending with the turning of earth and the weight of the sun above. The sun itself was a watchful companion. In early morning, it stretched across the fields gently, painting the mist in silver. By midday, it leaned heavy on shoulders, pressing sweat into skin, making every movement slower and more deliberate. At evening, when the light tilted into gold, the shadows grew long and comforting, and the workers could pause to see the fruits of their slow labor. Neat rows, dark soil turned, seeds covered, waiting for the unseen miracle of growth. Children, not yet old enough to labor long, found smaller duties. Some carried baskets of seed. Some followed the oxen, brushing flies away with leafy branches. Others knelt at the edges, playing with sticks in the mud, watched by their mothers who balanced the demands of care and work in the same patient breath. In their laughter and in their running feet across the ridges, there was a reminder that the work was not only about the present season, but about the future. Fields were tended not only for the stomachs of today, but for the children who would walk them tomorrow. There was a slow reverence for the earth itself. Before the first row was cut, someone might kneel, pressing a palm to the soil, whispering a brief prayer, sometimes only a breath. The earth was not an endless giver. It was alive, and it needed rest. Fields could not be forced year after year without pause, and so rotation was practiced. One patch left fallow, another sown with grains, another with beans or flax. The cycles were not scientific charts pinned to walls, but remembered through seasons passed down in story and example. Lunch came in silence too, not in the hushed stillness of a monastery, but in the quiet of tired mouths eating bread, cheese, and onion, grateful for water, grateful for shade under a hedgerow. A father might cut his piece in half for his son. A mother might hand the youngest a softened crust dipped in milk. The meal was plain, but hunger turned it into something rich, and togetherness gave it more flavor than spice ever could. Afternoons lengthened into long shadows. Tools slowed in movement, shoulders sagged, and yet there was no rush to end. To rush was to risk mistakes, and mistakes in farming were not easily forgiven by the land. A row planted too shallow might dry out. A ridge cut too deep might drown the seed. Care was more valuable than speed. And so the work continued as it had begun, deliberate, measured, unhurried. Evenings brought the sound of bells from the village. Not always church bells, sometimes a handbell rung by a child sent to the edge of the field, a signal that the day's light was nearly gone and supper waited. Workers leaned on their tools one last time, looking back across the field with quiet satisfaction. It was not pride in the loud sense, but a gentle acknowledgement. The earth had been touched well. The season had been prepared. The patience of many hands had been offered to the soil. Walking home together, their boots carried the mud of the field. Children were drowsy, leaning against parents. Tools were slung across shoulders, their weight familiar, their purpose fulfilled for another day. The fields behind them seemed to breathe in the softening dusk, holding in their hidden rows the quiet promise of tomorrow. Nights were never far from the fields either. In dreams, one could almost hear the rustle of crops that had not yet grown, or see the golden shimmer of harvest before it arrived. The mind wandered into seasons ahead, into meals yet to be shared, into winters warmed by the memory of full granaries. The land was not forgotten in sleep. It waited even in the silence of night, patient as always, knowing that the hands that left it would return at first light once more. And so the cycle held steady, field and farmer, seed and soil, sun and rain. No one rushed it, no one commanded it. They simply walked alongside it, year after year, as if walking with an old companion down a path that had no true end, only gentle turns into the same familiar places. The day after the celebration of harvest dawned quiet, as if the world itself needed a rest from the gathering and the songs of the night before. The faint glow of morning filtered through the thin fog that clung to the river, and the field still carried the smell of fresh earth turned by many hands. Birds returned to their nests among the trees, and the village, though content from the food and wine, began to stir again. Life in the settlement never truly stopped. Every pause was followed by new tasks that could not be delayed, for the turning of seasons was always near, and each season demanded work in its own way. The people rose slowly, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others stretching their limbs to ease the soreness from the labor of harvest. The old and the young alike knew that after the gathering came preservation, and after preservation came planning. The cycle of the year did not allow for idleness, even in times of plenty. This morning, smoke began to rise early from the chimneys of homes. Families set about boiling grains into porridge, preparing bread with the last of the fresh yeast, and cutting dried meat into small strips for stew. The food was warm and filling, and it gave strength to bodies that would spend the day working on storage and preparation for the colder months ahead. The men and women carried baskets from their homes to the large communal storehouse that had been built with care on a rise near the center of the settlement. This storehouse, larger than any single home, stood as a symbol of unity. Its thick walls, made from packed clay and timber beams, held the coolness of shade even when the sun rose high. Inside, shelves of woven reed and carved wood lined the walls, ready to hold jars of grain, dried fruit, salted meat, and clay pots filled with honey. It was here that the harvest would be measured, shared, and kept safe until spring returned. Children followed their parents with smaller baskets, eager to help in whatever way they could. Their steps were clumsy at times, and they sometimes spilled a few kernels of grain on the ground, but no one scolded them harshly. The elders watched with quiet approval, knowing that these small tasks were lessons for the future. Each stumble was a step toward learning the weight of responsibility that came with belonging to a community. As the sun lifted higher in the sky, the storehouse grew lively. The sound of jars being set down, the rustle of woven baskets, and the murmur of voices filled the space. Each family brought forward their share, not as payment, but as a duty to one another. For the survival of the village depended on this collective effort. The elders kept careful watch, noting the amounts brought forth, marking each contribution with scratches on a wooden tally board. They were not merchants seeking profit, but guardians ensuring that no one family carried more burden than another. Fairness was as essential as the food itself. A village divided by mistrust could not endure, no matter how fertile the soil or how plentiful the game in the forest. Outside the storehouse, some women prepared long strips of meat to hang and dry, threading them onto rods placed above slow fires that smoked steadily throughout the day. The smoke deterred insects, while the heat drew out moisture. In this way, meat could be kept for months, even through the bitter cold. Others worked with bundles of herbs, tying them into small bunches to be stored for medicine and flavoring. The sharp scent of rosemary, sage, and thyme lingered in the air, mixing with the smoke of drying racks and the sweet fragrance of honeycomb pressed into clay jars. Near the edge of the settlement, men mended nets and tools. Fibers woven into strong ropes were checked for fraying. Wooden handles of hoes and rakes were examined for cracks. A tool neglected in times of rest could fail in times of need, and the people knew well that sharp edges and strong bindings could mean the difference between hunger and fullness. The younger members of the village, not yet ready for heavy labor, were set to work with the task of shelling nuts gathered in the forest. They cracked them carefully between smooth stones, pulling the meat from within, which would later be roasted or ground into paste. Some children sang softly as they worked, their small voices carrying in the breeze. The melody was simple, a rhythm to match the tap of stone against shell, but it filled the air with warmth. Midday arrived, and the people paused briefly for food and water. They gathered in the shade of trees or on the benches carved from fallen logs, sharing bread, cheese, and cups of watered wine. There was no feast this time, only quiet satisfaction as they looked at the jars and bundles already stacked in the storehouse. Work remained, but progress was visible, and progress itself was a comfort. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the season ahead. The elders reminded the younger ones that the cold would soon come, and that no amount of celebration could change the length of winter. The river might freeze, the game might wander south, and storms might keep hunters and gatherers inside for days at a time. In such moments, the jars in the storehouse would be as precious as any treasure, and the unity of the people would be tested. As afternoon light stretched long across the fields, a group of hunters prepared for a short expedition. Though the harvest had filled the storehouse, fresh meat remained important, and furs were needed for warmth. They carried bows strung with sinew, quivers filled with arrows, and spears tipped with stone. Their steps were quiet, their voices hushed, for the forest demanded respect. Every hunt carried risk, and every return carried hope. The women, meanwhile, turned to weaving. They sat in small circles, hands moving with practiced ease as they worked wool and flax into cloth. The sound of the looms was soft but steady, like the heartbeat of the village. These cloths would become blankets, tunics, and coverings for the winter, each piece a shield against the cold. The patterns woven into them were not only practical but also symbols of memory, carrying the designs taught by grandmothers and passed to daughters. As the day neared its close, smoke from hearths curled once more into the sky. The storehouse was now half full, its shelves lined with jars and baskets. There was satisfaction in the sight, though no one spoke of it as finished. Work, like the seasons, was unending, and the people knew that tomorrow would bring more to do. Evening settled with the sound of a drum calling the village together again, not for feast or festival, but for council. Beneath the spreading branches of the great oak at the center of the settlement, the elders gathered the people to speak of winter plans. Each family was given a chance to voice concern, to ask questions, to offer suggestions. No decision was made without the voices of the people, for unity was as vital as food. An elder rose, her voice steady though her hair was white with age. She spoke of storms remembered from her youth, of years when the river froze so deeply that even firewood was scarce. She warned of the need to gather more wood before the first frost, to mend the roofs, and to ensure that every home had enough blankets. Others added their wisdom, recalling lean years and generous ones, each memory shaping the decisions of the present. The people listened closely, nodding in agreement. There was no fear in their eyes, only determination. They had seen hardship before, and they would see it again. What mattered was their unity, their willingness to carry the burdens together. When the meeting ended, families returned to their homes, carrying with them both the weight of duty and the comfort of belonging. The fires burned long into the night as food was cooked, tools were sharpened, and stories were told. The children, tired from work, fell asleep quickly, their dreams filled with the rhythms of the day. And so, the village settled into the cycle once more, turning labor into security, and security into hope. The harvest had been gathered, the storehouse filled, and the people prepared for the season to come. In their unity lay their strength, and in their daily tasks lay the quiet dignity of survival. The faint glow of dawn touches the village long before anyone stirs. The night has stretched itself across the land, and though the stars fade reluctantly, they surrender to the first thin line of gray rising over the horizon. Roosters greet the morning with uneven calls, their voices carrying across the thatched roofs and mist-wrapped paths. In the quiet, it feels as though time itself moves with great patience, slower than the steady trickle of water at the well. The households begin to stir one by one. A shutter creaks open, releasing a puff of smoky air from the hearth within. A child coughs softly, roused by the crackling of a rekindled fire. Soon, small wisps of smoke spiral into the air from multiple cottages, as if the village exhales together at the start of another day. Morning is not rushed here. It unfolds like a careful ritual. Mothers prepare simple porridge from grains saved in wooden bins, adding herbs or roots if they are lucky enough to have them. Fathers check the tools laid aside the night before, sharpening a blade or retying a handle, their hands moving with habits learned from countless mornings, just like this one. Children rub their eyes, reluctant to rise, yet obedient to the rhythm of a world that demands their presence. The animals, too, recognize the change in the air. Cows low gently as they await milking, chickens flutter from their roosts to scratch in the dirt, and dogs stretch in the cold light, shaking the dew from their fur. The entire village seems bound together by these patterns, as though each life, human or animal, plays a note in a song that has been sung for generations. As the sun climbs higher, the paths between cottages become busier. Men walk toward the fields with their tools slung over their shoulders. Their steps are slow and steady, carrying the weight of both labor and familiarity. Some carry woven baskets for seeds, others ropes and small wooden frames for mending fences. The land is their companion, demanding but loyal, and they return to it each day as if to greet an old friend. The fields, damp with dew, stretch outward in quiet expanses of brown and green. The earth waits patiently to be turned, seeded, and coaxed into life. Plows cut into the soil with heavy groans, guided by men whose shoulders ache but do not falter. Behind them, the scent of fresh earth rises, rich and damp, promising both toil and harvest. In another part of the village, the blacksmith begins his work. His small forge, tucked near the edge of the settlement, comes alive with the roar of fire as bellows pump air into the coals. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal rings out, steady as a heartbeat. Each strike shapes iron into the tools the village depends upon: hoes, nails, hinges, horseshoes. Though the sound is sharp, it is not disturbing. Instead, it carries reassurance, a reminder that even in hardship there is the craft of hands that never tire. The women gather at the well, balancing clay jars or wooden buckets against their hips. Their voices rise and fall in conversation, low and steady, blending with the splash of water drawn from below. Some talk of the weather, others of children or meals to be prepared. Their laughter, though soft, floats across the air like the gentle chime of bells. It is these simple gatherings that keep the village bound together, weaving strands of companionship into the fabric of daily necessity. Children, released from morning chores, drift into small groups. Some chase one another along the dirt paths, their bare feet kicking dust into the air. Others sit by the edge of the stream, dropping twigs into the water to watch them float. Their play is simple, yet it carries the echo of generations before them. The same games were played by their parents, and likely by their grandparents. A continuity as natural as the turning of seasons. By midday, the sun climbs high overhead, spilling light across the fields and cottages. Labor slows, but does not stop. Men rest briefly beneath the shade of trees, sharing bread and dried meat carried in cloth pouches. Women return indoors to stir pots simmering over the fire, the air thick with the scent of boiling herbs and broth. Children nap on woven mats, lulled by the hum of insects and the distant call of birds. The heat presses down gently, a blanket of warmth that reminds everyone of the summer to come. Later in the afternoon, the rhythm resumes. Cloth is woven at the loom, each thread stretched and tightened with deliberate care. Leather is cut and stitched into shoes. Wool is spun into yarn, the spindle turning slowly in the hands of those who have mastered the art since childhood. Every movement is purposeful, born not of haste, but of need, and yet carried out with a calm acceptance of time. Evening drifts in quietly, the sky painted in shades of gold and soft gray. The work in the field slows as tools are carried back, their edges dulled by another day's labor. The animals return to their pens, the chickens clucking softly as they settle into place, the cows moving with heavy patience. Smoke rises again from hearths as suppers are prepared, each cottage filling with the smell of stewed vegetables, grains, or roasted meat if fortune has been kind. As the sun sinks, the village gathers in fragments. Some sit outside their doors, watching the last of the light fade beyond the trees. Children whisper to one another as their eyes grow heavy. Old men tell quiet stories, their voices slow, their words carrying both memory and warning. The world beyond the village may be uncertain, but here, in the hush of dusk, there is peace. Night returns with its familiar silence. The stars awaken one by one, scattered across the dark expanse. The air cools, carrying the scent of earth, wood smoke, and grass. Inside the cottages, families curl close, warmed by the fading embers of the hearth. Sleep comes easily, drawn by the rhythm of a life bound to the land, steady and unchanging. So the village rests once more, ready to wake again with the dawn. Time flows gently, like the stream at its edge, carrying each life along its patient course. Nothing is rushed, nothing is wasted. And in that stillness, the world feels whole. The silence of the morning felt heavy, not the ordinary quiet of dawn, but something thicker, as if the air itself had absorbed sorrow overnight. Villagers rose from their beds slowly, dragging themselves into the day with the weight of yesterday still pressing down. The smoke from distant hills still curled upward, faint but steady, as though reminding everyone that loss did not vanish just because the sun had risen again. Those who had homes still intact opened their doors cautiously, peering out as if expecting more shadows to linger. Those whose homes had burned were already outside, sitting among the blackened skeletons of beams and collapsed roofs, staring at what had once been their lives. Children clung to their mothers, whispering questions that had no easy answers. Fathers walked silently, hands clenched at their sides, looking for tasks to occupy themselves, as if fixing fences or carrying buckets might help rebuild what had been stolen. The elders gathered in the square again, their faces pale with sleeplessness. They spoke in low voices, weighed down by the memory of flames and the echoes of panicked cries. Some argued over what should be done, others insisted on patience, and a few simply shook their heads in resignation. Hope had not disappeared, but it was fragile now, like a thin thread stretched too tightly. A woman named Leora, whose family had lost their home in the fire, knelt beside the remains of her hearth, She sifted through the ashes with her bare hands, ignoring the soot that blackened her skin. Every so often she pulled something small from the rubble, a charred spoon, a half-melted cup, a stone from the base of the wall. She set them aside in a neat pile, her lips moving silently as if naming each item was a prayer. Neighbors passed by and offered her food, a blanket, or a kind word, but she only nodded. Her grief seemed too deep for comfort, too personal to be shared aloud. Nearby, Tomas the blacksmith stood outside his forge, hammer dangling uselessly in his hand. The fire that had threatened the village had not reached his workshop, but he stared at the iron tools scattered around him as if they no longer had meaning. He whispered to himself, almost angrily, about how easily wood crumbled to flame, and how powerless his strong arms had been against something as wild as fire. His apprentices hovered close, afraid to disturb him, yet unwilling to leave him alone. Children played quietly near the stream, their laughter subdued but present. They collected pebbles and lined them up in patterns, their young minds eager for distraction. An older boy drew circles in the dirt with a stick, explaining that each circle represented the walls of a stronghold, safe and unburnable. The smaller children listened wide-eyed, believing in his invention, clapping when he promised that no fire could pass through lines drawn with enough care. Adults watched from a distance, half smiling at the innocence of such games, half aching with the reminder of what could not be so easily stopped. As the day wore on, small acts of rebuilding began. Men carried beams from one yard to another, raising temporary shelters of wood and cloth. Women shared loaves of bread, dividing them carefully so that every family received at least a small portion. Water was fetched again and again from the stream, not only for drinking but for washing away the soot that still clung to hands and faces. Slowly, in the midst of destruction, there was motion again, as if the village refused to remain paralyzed by grief. Yet whispers followed the work. Rumors slipped between conversations like shadows in the corner of the eye. Some claimed the fire had been unnatural, that it spread too quickly, as if driven by something more than wind. Others whispered of figures seen moving in the distance, strangers watching from the hills. A few spoke of curses, of old stories where villages burned because of broken promises to unseen powers. No one agreed on the truth, but the uncertainty gnawed at them more fiercely than hunger. That night, the elders called for silence in the square. Lanterns glowed softly, casting trembling light over faces that looked older than they had the week before. The chief elder, Marek, raised his hand and began to speak. His voice carried the firmness of one who had endured many trials, yet even he could not hide the tremor of fatigue. He reminded them of their resilience, of the times when storms had destroyed fields or sickness had spread through homes, and how they had survived each hardship together. He spoke of unity, of not letting suspicion or despair break the bonds that held the village as one. He urged them to share their strength, whether it was in the form of food, labor, or even just words of kindness. When he finished, there was silence. The villagers nodded, some with conviction, others with hesitation. They wanted to believe, but belief did not rebuild walls or restore what was gone. Still, Marek's words lingered in the night air like a fragile shield against despair. After the gathering, people returned slowly to their makeshift shelters. Some carried lanterns, others moved in darkness, trusting their feet to find the familiar paths. Above, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, stars glittering faintly, as if to remind the villagers that the world was vast and their suffering small in comparison. Yet within their small corner of the world, grief felt enormous, enough to silence laughter and weigh down every step. Leora curled beneath a blanket beside the ruins of her home, clutching the pile of saved trinkets to her chest. Tomas sat by the forge, staring into the dying embers without striking them alive again. Children whispered themselves to sleep with stories of unburnable walls. And Merrick, the elder, sat alone with his thoughts, wondering if words would ever be enough to hold together a people who now knew how quickly fire could consume everything. The night pressed on. The air cooled, the embers dimmed, and the whispers of fear and sorrow softened into dreams. Yet beneath the ashes, the village breathed still. Its people carried wounds, but they also carried one another. And though tomorrow held no promises, they would rise again, as they always had, to face whatever came next. The road out of the zone was never a single road. It was a network of dirt tracks, half-collapsed bridges, and hidden paths through forests that seemed older than time itself. Each curve, each rise, each field held stories of those who had traveled it before, stories that mixed sorrow with hope. For the coal miners who had walked into the silence of Chernobyl to dig, endure, and fight an invisible enemy, the path outward felt impossibly long. They had gone in as workers, men hardened by years of darkness underground, men whose lungs had grown used to the taste of coal dust and whose hands were etched with cuts that never healed. They had gone in with tools that seemed too small to fight something so enormous as radiation. They had dug with picks and shovels, with sweat and bone, carving a tunnel beneath a dying reactor. Now, having survived the work, they began the slow return to ordinary Earth. But there was nothing ordinary about it. As they left behind the exclusion zone, trucks carried them past villages that looked abandoned even when a curtain fluttered or smoke rose thinly from a chimney. Dogs barked at the passing convoys, stray and unclaimed, as if asking where the men had been and why they had come back different. The miners sat quietly in the open backs of the trucks, their eyes heavy, their bodies aching, their silence deeper than words. They did not joke, did not sing. Each man carried something invisible, something that could not be shrugged off. The air outside the zone was clearer, lighter, but it was not the same as before. The men noticed the difference in small ways. Bread tasted like bread again, not metallic or strange. Water cooled the tongue rather than carrying the faint bitterness of iodine tablets. Yet even with these comforts, nothing felt untouched. At night, when they lay on cots in temporary barracks, the men dreamed of tunnels. They dreamed of crawling through soil that dripped and burned, of hearing the reactor hum above them like a living beast. Some awoke in sweat, though the night air was cool. Others stared at the ceiling, replaying every step, every swing of the pick, every glance exchanged in the gloom. They did not speak of the dreams. When morning came, they ate their porridge slowly, pushing spoonfuls around the bowls. They avoided mirrors, for their faces had thinned and their eyes had grown hollow. They knew they were different men, yet no one had the words to say exactly how. As the convoys moved further from Chernobyl, the miners were told they could return home to their towns and villages. Some longed for this, aching to see wives, children, parents, to hear familiar voices and feel the warmth of homes not built from military canvas. Others feared it, knowing that they carried something invisible back with them, something their families could never see or understand. When at last the men returned to their villages, reunions were quieter than anyone expected. Wives wept softly, but quickly hid their tears. Children clung tightly but then stepped back, uncertain, sensing something foreign in their fathers. The men smiled, but their smiles were small, brief things. Life resumed, at least on the surface. The men walked the streets, went to markets, stood in lines for bread, sat on benches in courtyards. Yet wherever they went, Silence followed. Neighbors stared, whispering. Some people crossed the street, afraid of invisible danger. Others looked with pity, with admiration, or with unease. At home, the miners struggled with the rhythm of ordinary days. Some found their old routines again, fixing fences, chopping wood, smoking by the kitchen window. But for many, the work of the zone clung to them. They woke at night coughing, their joints aching. A strange fatigue settled in their bones, heavier than coal dust, harder to shake than exhaustion. In time, illness would come for many of them. The invisible work of radiation crept silently, slowly, marking their blood, their lungs, their hearts. Some grew weak too soon. Others tried to ignore the signs until they could not. They were men who had been asked to hold back the fire of a ruined reactor, and though they succeeded, the fire left its scars. Yet even as sickness spread, pride remained. The miners knew what they had done. They knew that their tunnel, dug with sweat and will, had helped prevent something worse, something unthinkable. Though no medal shone on their chests, though no monuments carried their names, they carried the knowledge within them. In kitchens lit by weak bulbs, they told their children stories not of the zone, but of coal, of the mines, of ordinary work. They spoke of comradeship, of laughter underground, of songs sung in the dark. They left unsaid the other stories, the ones filled with radiation and silence, for those stories were too heavy to hand down. Still, whispers traveled. Villagers knew, historians knew. The world, in fragments, came to know. The miners were remembered not in banners or statues, but in quiet mentions, in the pages of books, in the fading voices of documentaries. And in the end, that was enough. For memory itself is a kind of monument. Time moved slowly, and the miners faded one by one. Some were buried in simple graves, wooden crosses marking their names. Others passed far from their home villages, in hospitals where doctors shook their heads at illnesses too strange to cure. Yet always, in the silence of those final days, there was a sense that they had done something no one else could have done. And so, the story of the Chernobyl coal miners is not just about tunnels or radiation or illness. It is about endurance, about ordinary men asked to face extraordinary darkness. It is about comradeship forged in soil, about strength that no one could see but everyone could feel. The zone remains, silent and still, an echo of disaster and memory. Trees grow, animals roam, the buildings crumble, but the story of the miners lies beneath it all, buried in the earth like the tunnels they dug. It whispers to anyone willing to listen. And now, as you let this story settle, you can close your eyes and imagine those tunnels, not as places of fear, but as places of courage. You can imagine the men resting now, free from labor, their shovels laid aside, their boots finally light. You can imagine the silence of the zone not as emptiness, but as respect, as a pause that honors their work. Perhaps in that silence you can find your own rest. So close your eyes. Let the weight of the day fall away. Breathe slowly, deeply, as if inhaling the cool night air outside the zone, far from the reactor, far from the tunnels. Know that stories like this hold within them not only sorrow but peace. And as you drift, may you carry with you the quiet strength of those miners, their endurance, their silence, their humanity. Sleep now, with their story folded gently around you. If this story has helped you find calm or sleep tonight, please consider subscribing for more quiet journeys through history. Every chapter, every tale is here to keep you company and ease you into rest. Thank you for listening, and good night.